All right, so we are looking at the Trail of Tears. This ties back into our unit on Manifest Destiny when we had groups of people moving from the East Coast into the Midwest and into the West. So we have this is going to tie in together a little bit with what we did last year, really, in 2019. So quick warm up. You can honestly pause this video at any point, especially if you're taking your notes and typing them in. Just pause the video and write your notes down. So the first question is, what does this image tell you about what it must have been like to travel on the Trail of Tears? I want you to just take a second and think about this. All right. That's for you to pause the video, not for me. All right. So what does I can't actually see because this bar isn't. What does this image show? So I want you to also take a moment to look at this image here that I have. It is showing a movement of people. I just want you to pay attention to what this movement shows. It's talking about land routes and water routes. It's showing quite a few things, but what's important about this map, and I'm just going to preface it with it now, is that this is the actual route that Native Americans took when they went on the Trail of Tears. I'm going to go into a little bit more information in a second here. Some of you guys in my class might remember when I brought this up briefly and showed you guys some pictures, but I'm going to go over it all together today. But this is basically the actual movement and path that Native Americans took from where they lived initially to where they were now relocated to move. And that will make sense in a second. So there were two prevailing thoughts on what to do about Native Americans in the US. There were some ideas on whether or not to civilize them, which Mr. Hoyt, I'm sure he knows all about, like assimilating Native Americans and making them civilized. And then the other option that people considered was remove them, just displace them entirely, kick them out of where they are currently. Both these options were used. Obviously, George Washington kind of went through it where he believed that if we civilized the Indians, Native Americans, and they assimilated, then they could be part of our culture and they could be part of the U.S. And that was the prevailing idea for the majority of the U.S. From when Washington was president until Jackson became president. And he believed that the actual way to do it was to just remove the Native Americans from where they were and to get rid of them. Something to keep in mind when we're looking at civilizing versus removing is that Native Americans had their own opinions on this. Some Native Americans took very easily to the idea of civilizing. Being civilized, they were happy to settle down. They were happy to take on the settler idea of having a system of government, having a farm, having a little town. So one of the most popularly known groups of tribes were the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast. And they were the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. And they were known for being very civilized. They had been trading with Americans for a very long time and with settlers before that. When they had the option of assimilating and being able to stay in their lands, they chose to assimilate. So they would, a lot of them adopted Christianity. They created their own alphabet for their language. They created their own system of government. So the Cherokees created a constitution that was actually based on the U.S. Constitution. And there were even newspapers. So Cherokee even created their own newspaper to publish and share in their tribe where they lived, I guess town is more like it. But basically they had all this land in the southeast and everyone was doing pretty well. Bureau of Indian Affairs was basically staying on top of them, making sure that they were assimilating, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs were the government portion that took care of the Native Americans and watched over them. The missionaries also worked on converting them to Christianity, but basically everyone was working pretty well and staying in their original location and adopting the American way of life until we actually had a gold rush in Georgia called I think it's the the Dalhousie. I always mess up the name, but it's maybe Mr. White can look up for me really quick. But there's a gold rush in Georgia that creates a big issue in Georgia because all of a sudden everyone wants to go to Georgia. Literally everyone wants to go to Georgia. This is the first gold rush of its kind here. It's 1829, I believe. And they all want to go to Georgia. And one of the boom towns that they want to set up is actually right in the territory of I believe it's the Cherokee Nation. So all of a sudden we have this issue where the white settlers want to be in the area that the Cherokees are currently in. And the Cherokees are saying, absolutely not. This is our land. You can't just come in here and take it. These white settlers are like, government, are we allowed to do that? Because we would like to do that. And it just kind of created a massive contentious issue between the Georgia state government and the Cherokee Nation. So gold rushes, man, they really spice things up. But basically, we have this issue where Cherokees are very much a civilized group. They have their own culture. They have a very American way of life. They're settled, and they're being told by a government that someone can just come in and take that away. So they were not happy about that. Georgia claims that they can make laws for the Cherokee Nation, that they can confiscate land if they want it. This was a very common issue because the Cherokees believed that if we went through all the right routes of authority and we've done everything we were told to do, there's no way that they can just take away our land like that. That shouldn't happen. They can't do something like that. Georgia claims that they have the right to do that. John Marshall and the Supreme Court rules against Georgia, saying, no, Georgia, you cannot take the Cherokee Nation land. You can't just take it to use it for something else. That is their land. Andrew Jackson, the current president at the time, says, and this is a reported statement, apparently says that Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So basically, Andrew Jackson, this is a reported statement by Jackson, but Jackson's actions after this situation prove that Jackson was doing this, but basically he believed that John Marshall the Supreme Court might rule one way, but Jackson had the full authority to institute any laws or rules that he wanted to do. So he ignores the ruling and decides to follow through with the federal law, which is the Indian Removal Act, which initially the Indian Removal Act is meant to just kind of pay the Native Americans to leave their land. It's meant to be kind of a positive situation where they're trying to get them to peacefully leave, but a lot of Native Americans do not want to peacefully leave and end up fighting against this ruling and this act. So Jackson gets Congress to pass this law that will force natives west of the Mississippi into Oklahoma. Americans did not want this land yet, because it wasn't considered for good farming. And that's something else to keep in mind, is that this isn't necessarily land that immediately Americans wanted. They're not like at the gate trying to get in and like take the Cherokees' land necessarily, other than the area where the boomtown for the gold rush was happening. But Jackson predicts that with Manifest Destiny and this great goal for America spreading west, they're eventually going to want to take this land and own it. So that brings me back to the Indian Removal Act, where they are either peacefully or not so peacefully removed from their land and taken to Oklahoma. So they were all spread out. If you look at this image here, they're spread out in different areas. I have a little annotation thing, spotlight. So they're all spread out in different areas here. And they each have their different areas. So the Seminole are here. We have the Cherokee, we have the Muskogee, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. So they're all spread out. And then with the Indian Removal Act, they are basically sent away to move to the new Native American territory that is west of the Mississippi River. Choctaw are first to be sent, and they make deals with the Indian Bureau of Affairs. Seminoles fight, are defeated, and also sent. Cherokee supposedly signed a treaty, but 16,000 Cherokees petition against treaty. Congress approves it anyway. Something to keep in mind with these treaties is that sometimes 2 or 3 people who would go in representing the entire Cherokee Nation would go and make an agreement with the government, but obviously not always random 2 or 3 people going in and talking to the government are going to represent every single person. So there was kind of an issue of who was actually ruling over the Cherokee Nation, who had the responsibility to sign away their rights through a treaty and be sent to Oklahoma. But the reason why I was showing you why where all the nations lived and how spread out they were was because when they moved to Oklahoma, they are now all crammed together into these spaces. So the Choctaw are now here. This is just Oklahoma. This is one state. This is the Choctaw here, Chickasaw. We've got Cherokee. We even have like Cheyenne, Arapaho for those of you who are researching other tribes. But basically, they're taken from this land that was decent for farming, was either decent for hunting, decent for whatever they were doing initially, what their way of life was, and now they're put in Oklahoma, which the landscape is not the greatest for what they did before. There's not like it's not the most bountiful land. So back to the Trail of Tears. I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but that image earlier of the people all on horseback, should have just put the image back here, but all the people here on horseback, this is the Trail of Tears. They are just sent to walk basically from either Georgia, Florida, all the way to Oklahoma, where they will now live here. And thousands die on this travel, on this trip. There was terrible conditions, lack of food, lack of water. Lots of people die from pneumonia. It's pretty horrible. They're treated terribly by the Army. It's just an overall horrific experience for the Native Americans. Here's more pictures of the movement. But overall, not our greatest moment in American history. Andrew Jackson's choice to do this was definitely not with the hope of taking care of the Native Americans. It was all for his own betterment or for the betterment of white settlers. So that is my quick rundown of the Trail of Tears.
I think
Anything to add, Mr. Hoyt?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the interesting takeaways is that these 5 tribes, these 5 nations, 5 groups of people are like referred to as the civilized tribes. And that's almost a term you would see like bolded in a history book or like as like a flashcard for like say an AP test or like a big test like on like a high school context. But the term itself is really interesting because it's a word that it's kind of subjective, to say the least, that these groups of people are trying to make themselves seem more like the next door neighbor of the United States that has like moved in so that they're left alone. So in the case of the Cherokee, they adopt a formal written language, not because it's something they wanted to do, because they felt that they needed to. They did it so that they could seem more like their neighbors, say in Georgia or South Carolina or North Carolina, so that they'd be like left alone. Like, oh, if we make newspapers and have written languages and we adopt a constitution that looks like theirs, they'll leave us alone. Like we won't seem as different than them and they'll let us continue doing what we're doing. But that like doesn't prove to be the case.
Steps for
I guess it's like
self-preservation.
the word civilized is almost like just a word for like being more similar to the people who are like near you. Because it's clear that when your neighbors are, in the case of the United States, are forcibly like driving you from your land 1,000 miles away, that they themselves are not particularly civilized. So the term for me is kind of problematic, but I recognize like why it's used historically, because these are 5 tribes that tried to assimilate at a period in time when most were not. And going forward in the 19th century, there's going to be like a legacy of future Native American groups like knowing the story of like the Cherokee or the Creeks or the Seminoles and thinking to themselves like, well, why would we try to assimilate? It didn't work out that well for this group. Like we need to hold out as long as we can to prevent like what seemingly is going to be inevitable. Like if you go the route of the Cherokee, like you're going to just set yourself up for failure on 2 fronts.
They had a flawed thought that they could preserve their community and their location by assimilating, which is just more of a flaw in the United States government than in the Cherokee or the
And they're also a group of people who are in a space that is like the frontier of the new nation, the United States, that it's declaring itself independent in 1776, and very few people live west of the Appalachian Mountains, which all of these groups, with the exception of the Seminole, are. I guess the Cherokee and the Creek are on like the foothills of like the western side of those mountains, but nonetheless, like they're on the frontier, they're on the edge of where this country is at its formation, and it takes some time before they're actually like large populations of people who want to settle where they live and exploit the resources that are in that space. And as the rest of this unit goes forward, we'll see that the story of people having their land or cultures stripped of them in the name of the movement westward of the United States or in the name of resource extraction is not unique to the 1820s nor to Andrew Jackson, tragically. I think that is it for us.